Hello, my name's Sorensen. Thanks for joining me on this ASMR video as I continue with my album talk series. Ship Arriving Too Late by Frank Zappa is one of those albums that I return to regularly, and as a composer and musician, it is perhaps the most impactful and influential album I have bought over the years. I heard it first as a teenager and have regularly returned to it throughout my adult life, especially whenever I was stuck on a complex piece of music or was in need of a jolt of inspiration to start work on a new piece of music. Although it is not even my favourite album by Frank Zappa, I definitely have a nostalgic love for this record. And there is something about the complexity of the music and the colour of the recording and production that I find motivational. The full title of this album is Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch, as can be seen depicted here on this cool looking minimalist front cover. You can clearly see the bow of the ship and the drowning witch's pointy hat. This image also has the added benefit of looking like a Z and an A to symbolise the name Zappa. I'd always assumed that Frank scribbled this design himself because it so perfectly complements the humour of his lyrics on this record. However, it turns out that the image was actually from a cartoon series called Droodle by the artist Roger Price. And it was the image that inspired Frank to come up with the name. My brother let me hear this album originally when I was 13. And though I was initially frightened and confused by what I was hearing, it started to make sense to me after a few more listens, and I became obsessed with the man and his music. From my perspective at the time, the unusual compositional style, structure, rhythm, and tonality of this music blew my young mind and simultaneously filled me with wonder, jealousy, and self-doubt. Although I was listening to a rock band, the arrangements on some of the album, especially the instrumental track Envelopes, sounded like some kind of weird classical music being played on non-classical instruments. I didn't know an awful lot about classical music at that age, but I had heard Stravinsky's masterpiece, Rite of Spring, blaring from my older brother's room, and thought that a lot of this album was comparable. Like Stravinsky, Frank Zappa was fascinated with the idea of changing rhythms and time signatures constantly throughout his music. And although I didn't know it at the time, Frank also wrote a lot of orchestral music, so he was an actual classical composer. I'd started playing guitar when I was 8 or 9, and by 13 I was already a pretty good musician. But as soon as I heard this incredible album, something switched in my brain. My ambition to become a great rock guitarist was ended by hearing this astonishing sounding music. Because I knew I'd never reach the levels of technical ability I was hearing, no matter how dedicated I was to the guitar or how many hours I was prepared to practice. I was already at something of a disadvantage because I'm left-handed but learned to play on a right-handed guitar. Although this gave me an initial advantage in being able to get my left hand to play tricky chord shapes and progressions relatively easily, it was ultimately a hindrance, especially when trying to get my right hand to pick out melodic lead lines, and when trying to master scales and modes and then play them at speed. Frank was known for having great musicians in his various band lineups over the years. And during the early 80s, when this album came out, he had a young guitar virtuoso named Steve Vai. In the liner notes next to Steve's name, it says, "Impossible Guitar Parts." This seemed an entirely appropriate way of describing what I was hearing, since Ship Arriving Too Late was the first time I'd ever heard guitar playing that I knew in my core was completely out of reach for me. I was a fairly precocious kid at the time and wasn't fazed by any music or guitarists I'd heard until that point, because I always seemed to be able to work out how to play what I was hearing. But this was an entirely different listening experience. The playing was too fast and the music too complex to even comprehend. Remember also that this album was recorded back before the digital age and before musicians had the ability to manipulate their playing performances with computers. Steve Vai had to actually learn and play these ridiculous guitar parts in the studio in real time. Although Ship Arriving Too Late more or less ended my young ambition to become a great guitarist, The album simultaneously ignited a new determination in me to try and write sophisticated songs and one day become a composer in my own right. Frank Zappa was known and quite often dismissed for his risky and often puerile comedic lyrics. But for those who took the time to listen to his music, he was a ridiculously prolific composer with a consistently unique musical voice. That voice was synonymous with complexity, non-conformity, colour, unusual time signatures, and virtuosic musicianship. Working from the 60s until his death in 1993, he produced more than 60 albums of material. Despite having many different lead vocalists and a constantly evolving lineup of exceptional musicians performing with him for 30 years, every one of those 60 plus releases was unmistakably a Frank Zappa album. That consistency to sound unlike anyone else for so long, over so many albums, was an amazing and unrivaled achievement in rock music. As well as devoting his life to creating unconventional music, Frank Zappa was an unconventional person. For example, he and his wife Gail named their 4 children Moon Unit, Dweezil, Amit, and Diva. Dweezil went on to become a guitar virtuoso in his own right and devoted a significant amount of his time to finding new audiences around the world for his father's music. I actually saw Dweezil and his group doing an amazing 3-hour show of Frank's music in Edinburgh a while back. Moon Unit, the oldest sibling, actually performed vocals on some of Frank's recordings while he was still alive, including the song Valley Girl from the album Ship Arriving Too Late. Valley Girl ended up being Frank's biggest hit, since it received fairly widespread radio play due to its quirky subject matter. Moon wrote most, if not all, of the lyrics for this comedic song, which mocked the vocal inflections of San Fernando Valley girls to audiences everywhere. Imagine it as an edgy precursor to the movie Clueless with Alicia Silverstone. As we can see on the back cover, it lists the 6 tracks on this album and all of the musicians that Frank had performing with him on the record. On side 1, track 1, No, Not Now. Track 2, Valley Girl. Track 3, I Come From Nowhere. On side 2 of the album, track 1, Drowning Witch, track 2, Envelopes, track 3, Teenage Prostitute. It says here, all selections composed, arranged and produced by Frank Zappa. The lineup on this album is Frank Zappa, lead guitar, vocals, Steve Vai, impossible guitar parts, Ray White, rhythm guitar, vocals, Tommy Mars, keyboards, Bobby Martin, keyboards, sax and vocals, Ed Mann, percussion, Scott Thunes, bass, Arthur Barrow, bass, Patrick O'Hearn, bass, Chad Wackerman, drums, Roy Estrada, vocals, Ike Willis, vocals, Bob Harris, vocals, Lisa Popile, vocals on Teenage Prostitute, and Moon Zappa, vocals on Valley Girl. Thanks for watching this video about Frank Zappa's Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch, and for making it to the end. If you haven't already, then please subscribe to this channel, and if you feel so inclined, then also hit the like button. If you are a huge Zappa fan, then let me know your favourite album and or track in the comments, and also how you were introduced to his music. If you've never heard him before and want a nice, fluffy, safe introduction, then why not check out Valley Girl, featuring his daughter Moon Unit, and then take it from there. Thanks.